Good evening. Good evening, everyone. First of all, on behalf of the Jewish Studies program, I would like to thank everyone for coming tonight. It's a great privilege for me to introduce our speaker tonight, Ari Shavit. Ari, as most of you know, is a senior columnist and a senior journalist for Haaretz newspaper. In addition, he wrote the book, the highly acclaimed book and the bestseller book, My Promised Land. But for me personally, more importantly, Ari is someone who I read for now maybe 15 years. And I think what makes Ari so interesting and so unique and maybe different than other columnists I read is that with Ari, I never know what to expect. I mean, it's true that he is a strong voice for liberal, secular, modern Israel, but at the same time, I can think of many occasions when I read Ari criticizing the left and writing in support of the right, mostly in the case with Iran, and in many other cases, more often criticizing Netanyahu and supporting the labor. But for me personally, when I read a column, I'm looking for someone who is not predictable, someone who can challenge my opinion. And Ari Shavit did it many times. He made me rethink my position. And I think that's what makes him so unique and so interesting. Finally, I would like to thank Ari for coming today. Ari, it's a long day for Ari. He just landed this morning from Israel. And when we asked him, when we invited him at the Jewish Studies to come tonight, he was very excited. And I know that even though it's a long day, he made sure to come here early enough to meet with students. And he was really interested in coming and talking to students and hearing and learning more about Vassar, not just to come and talk and live. And we appreciate it. I'm sure Ari, by the way, by now is pretty exhausted, but it doesn't mean in any way that you should make his life easy. I invite you to ask him all the tough questions, and I'm sure he's ready for the challenge. And I believe we're going to have a respectful, meaningful, interesting evening. So I would like to invite Ari to take the stage.
So thank you, Tzach, for encouraging everybody to attack me viciously soon. And you'll have the chance of doing that. I'm very happy to be here. As Tzach said, it's been a long journey, and if I say really stupid things, it's all because of jet lag. But I've heard a bit about what has been happening here. And I realize that probably many of you think that a lot of what was published and said is inaccurate and unfair. But obviously, for whatever reason, this beautiful, high quality, calm college in this amazing setting feels very strongly about my country, this way or another. So I thought it is my duty, once asked, to come here and try to do my best to help in facilitating a meaningful conversation. I have very strong opinions. I'm an opinionated guy. I know the solution to every Israeli and Middle Eastern problem. That's a joke. But I'm not into that. I'll share my views and my opinions, but I really think that what's so important is to have a civilized, respectful conversation. We don't have to agree, we should not agree. But let us wrestle with the complexity in an intelligent way. Let us respect each other. And let's try to have a conversation that makes us all better people. Where I'm present, there's no censorship, there's no question that cannot be asked. But I really hope that we can listen to one another and actually have a kind of different kind of conversation about Israel than what most people have in most places in the world, not only here. And because of that, what is really important for me is not what I'll be saying soon, but to hear you. And I really think that the second half, as far as I'm concerned, more than half of this evening will be about the conversation. I want to hear you. I want to listen to hear what you have, what's on your mind. And I really want us all to be engaged in a meaningful conversation. But I'm expected to launch this. So I'll begin by telling you a bit about myself, my book, my country, and how I see the issues of Israel, Palestine, and the Middle East. I was born in Rehovot, a university town. In many ways, it was a little America out in the Middle East. Actually, some of my father's colleagues used to come even to Poughkeepsie to some research and development labs not far away. I've heard the name Poughkeepsie when I was 7. I don't think many Israelis did. Later on, I had the privilege of actually spending a year in America, which had a deep impact on me. I was only 11, and I spent a year in New York, and I got a taste of American political life and some of your own problems, because I insisted on going to a non-Jewish school, to a public school in New York. I was bused from Brooklyn Heights to the neighboring neighborhoods that were not that privileged at the time. The brilliant boy sitting next to me who became a kind of friend, although we had some rivalry, his name was Spike Lee. So I got really a feel of some of the tensions that you have in this country when I was pretty young. But if I am to tell you about my early experiences as an Israeli, one of the first memories I have is in the days before the Six-Day War. I was a 9-year-old boy, and 3-4 Arab armies were closing in on Israel. There was not 1 inch of occupied territory at the time. There was not one settlement. And yet, our neighbors wanted to destroy Israel. They literally talked and intended to throw us into the sea. And one of the most dramatic, memorable moments of my childhood is me speaking to my father, asking him, will this happen? Will we die soon? Will Israel be crushed by the neighboring strong armies that were surrounding us? Later on, when I was a young soldier, to give you a complicated Israeli experience, we all have to serve in the army. I was a very bad soldier, but I did my duty. I was something of a pacifist, a poetic, romantic guy, but I found myself there in the army. And I saw some Israeli misdoings. I saw serious violations of ethical codes during military operations. It was a devastating experience for me. But the other side of it was that when the 20-year-old boy that I was, in a very naive way, sent a letter to the chief of staff saying that things that should not be happening happened, I was actually asked by my officers, the chief of staff, getting my letter, my naive, ridiculous letter, actually went to my commanders and demanded that an inquiry will be launched. And an inquiry was launched. So that also already gives you a kind of picture of the two sides of the experience. On the one hand, the horrible things that happen, And on the other hand, the fact that probably unlike any army in the world, a 20-year-old sensitive private could reach the chief of staff and have an inquiry launched because of his complaints. Later on, after the army, I became a peace activist, a human rights activist, and later on, a journalist. In many ways, my life throughout these years has been about the tension between my liberal values, between my yearning for peace and my feeling that we must have peace, and the realization that I live in a brutal reality. And struggling with this tension between my values and the values that I think Israel should be about, and the reality that we find ourselves, the reality of the conflict. This has been the struggle of my life. And that led me to write my book, My Promised Land, The Triumph and Tragedy of Israel. Because as I looked around, I realized that even I, living in the middle, in the center of Israel in so many respects, don't get the Israel story. There's so much polemics about Israel. There's so much strong emotions. The people who feel that Israel can do no right and the people who feel that Israel can do no wrong. And as I looked around myself, I said, no, this is not what's really going on. Where's the real story? There is a need to get out of it and really try to look at this complex reality. So many people treat us Israelis as if we are either angels or demons. We are no angels. We did wrong things in the past and we do wrong things now. But we are no demons. We happen to be humans, like all other humans. And our human story happens to be both a remarkable and deeply saddening human story. This is why Israel is both a triumph of the human spirit, and there is such tragedy in its history and in its present. So what I try to do in my book is try to get out of the cliches, both the cliches of overprotective love and the cliches of this compulsive hate. And I really try to listen to the life stories of real people in order to try to write a kind of biography or autobiography of a nation. So, at the end of that long journey, I will not get into the details now, I'll answer any questions regarding that. Where do I stand? First of all, first and foremost, I deeply, deeply oppose occupation and settlements. My entire adult life has been about fighting occupation and settlements. The first text that I wrote that went into print was a peace movement, a Peace Now leaflet, warning how dangerous and horrific settlements would be. I hate to say how long ago I wrote it, over 30 years ago. And throughout the years, I did my best to stop settlement activity as a demonstrator, as an activist, as a journalist, as a writer, in my articles, in my TV appearances, wherever I do. And I tried to look for a way to end occupation without risking Israel's very existence. So that has been my passion. In my mind, occupation is unfair to the Palestinians because it deprives them of their rights, their human rights, their civil rights, their national rights. But occupation is also dangerous for Israel. It endangers the core of our existence. Because the whole point about Israel was to have one nation, one place, one country, where the Jews for once will be a majority so they can express themselves politically within a democratic context. This is what Israel is all about. We've been a minority, and we are a minority in so many countries. In some countries it's great, like in this one. In so many countries it was horrific, and it's still horrific to this day. So the need was to have one place where the Jewish people can express itself within a democratic context while respecting the rights of every non-Jew. And the moment we went into occupation and we built settlements, we are risking the raison d'etre of Israel. So this is why I've spent so many years, so much energy, fighting occupation and settlements. And I will not give up on that struggle until we win. But I think that occupation and settlements, as bad as they are, must be put into context. And I'll refer now to 3 layers of context. The first one is that Israel did try to end occupation. In 1993, our great Prime Minister, the late Yitzhak Rabin, who was a warrior throughout his life, decided to try to end the tragedy of the conflict with peace. He decided to reach out to Yasser Arafat, shake his hand, and try to come to terms with us. For those of you who don't remember or do not know, Yasser Arafat was 100 times more toxic for us, more radioactive, than Fidel Castro was to America. But it took America over 50 years, nearly 60 years, and President Obama to come to terms with Castro's Cuba. It just happened now. Israel, 23 years ago, reached out and decided to try to end the conflict and opened its heart to Yasser Arafat. Sadly, 5 months after he arrived in Gaza, the first bus exploded in Tel Aviv. We hoped for peace. We tried peace. The result was terror. But we did not give up. 6 years later, another Israeli warrior, Ehud Barak, then Prime Minister, decided to try to end the conflict as well. He went to Bill Clinton's peace summit in Camp David. I do not want to intervene in your politics, so I'll say nothing about Mrs. Clinton. But Mr. Clinton is probably the most able individual to bring peace in the Middle East. He has the passion, the compassion, the intelligence, the EQ, the IQ. He put all his capital as the President of the United States in the last 6 months of his tenure into trying to end the conflict. But that courageous attempt ended with a horrible terror offensive. We could have been today in the 16th year of a free Palestinian state in all of Gaza Strip, 95% of the West Bank, and half of Jerusalem. The conflict could have been way beyond us. But Israel's courageous offer was rejected, and the outcome was a horrible offensive of suicide bombing, with over 1,000 Israelis and 3,000 Palestinians dying in the turmoil. But we didn't give up. 5 years later comes Ariel Sharon, the Israeli extremist, the warmonger, the father of settlements, the person perceived by the world as such a radical, dangerous person, and by the way, the person who I opposed throughout my political life before that. And he, of all people, pulls out the Gaza Strip, dismantles every settlement, so there is no more occupation in a direct way in the Gaza Strip, not one settlement. Is the outcome a Palestinian Singapore? The outcome is a Hamas-controlled territory oppressing women, gays, Christians, Palestinian individuals, and attacking Israel every few months. I do not think we should give up. It is essential to try peace again. It is essential to end occupation. But we have to understand why some Israelis, many Israelis, are burned by those three experiences that I've described. The second layer of context is the region we live in. Only 5 years ago, so many of my liberal American friends, and not only liberals, were hoping that the Arab Spring will free the Arabs. So many of my friends compared the Arab Spring to the American Revolution, to the French Revolution, to perestroika. We really believe that the Google kids will rule Egypt. Few years have passed, and there's hardly any hope anywhere. I'm an Israeli, but I care about my Arab neighbors. And when I look at my Arab neighbors, when I look about young Arabs your age, what hope do they have? It's either a military dictatorship, a reactionary monarchy, an Islamic theocracy, or bloody chaos. Only in Tunisia there is some hope. In Kurdistan, hopefully some hope in Lebanon, marginal. But there isn't one country around us that combines prosperity with liberty. I don't know what's the explanation for that. I really don't. But I know that this is where I live. And I'm so saddened by this. There is so much human suffering throughout our region. We all are aware of what's happening in Syria, but it's everywhere. It's Yemen, it's Libya, it's Iraq. This does not justify for one moment Israeli wrongdoing. It doesn't justify one settlement being built. It doesn't justify the statements and the policy of my prime minister, whom I oppose every day. But it's where we live. We don't have Wisconsin politics in our region. There isn't one country where you can go, except for Israel, to a Supreme Court to get defense of your rights. You'll be laughed at. There isn't protection of minorities anywhere. When I was fighting passionately for peace, I told my fellow Israelis, we are going to have 21st century Europe. Today we have 11th century Europe, 10 miles from our borders. Gays are being thrown from rooftops. Christians are burned. Women are stoned for adultery. This is where we live. It doesn't justify Israeli wrongdoing, but if you really care about the people of the third world, if you really care about Arabs and Palestinians, you have to acknowledge all this. There is a human catastrophe all around us. And the world doesn't do a thing to save the people of Syria. We don't know even if it's the numbers, if it's 250,000 or 500,000 people who got murdered in the last years while we were so obsessed with Israeli politics. The third layer of context is Jewish history and the Jewish future. I believe, that because of the astonishing success of the Jewish minority in this country, many people have lost touch with the real Jewish context. By the way, this happened to Jews and non-Jews, to many people on the extreme left and on the extreme right. People tend to think, on the extreme left and the extreme right, that the Jews are the masters of the universe, so powerful, so strong, so privileged. So let me remind you that while it's true, and I think there is nothing to be ashamed of, that so many Jews have been so successful in business, in science, in arts, in law, you name it, over the last 100 years, especially in this country, not only this country. Previously, mainly it was in Germany. What is the real story of the Jewish people? The Jews are a demographic midget. There are three great monotheistic religions. One has over 2 billion people. The second has over 1.5 billion. And the third has 14 million on a good day. We make so much noise, people get confused, and we get confused. This is a small, lonely people with a traumatic past and an unclear future. It's an endangered people. In many ways, both the Jewish people and Israel are a kind of underdog on steroids, while being so vulnerable. Basically, power was created, especially after the Holocaust, to defend it, but it's still fundamentally endangered. Israel, with all its might, and it has strength, is a territorial midget. Israel is 6th or 7th the size of the state of New York. And as far as I remember, you have 50 states. Not all great empire states, but 50 states. We are 6th, 7th the size of the state of New York. We're smaller than New Hampshire. This is what we are talking about, Greater Israel, and I oppose the Greater Israel. Greater Israel, that's what we're talking about. So we are talking about this people, that so many people have lost the perspective to see what it is about. And this brings me for 2 minutes to my book. What I saw while writing my book, the question I asked myself, is why did we have the need to go there? I began with my own great-grandfather who lived in London, a great life. And I said, why would he leave behind London and travel to the remote, barren province Palestine was? It seems crazy, but it was not. Because the founding fathers and mothers of Israel, 50 years before the state was established, realized that Europe was becoming a death trap to its Jews. And again, people talk of Israel as colonialism. We were white Christian Europe's ultimate other for 1,500 years. We were treated like dirt. We never knew where we'll be next year. We never knew where the next pogrom will strike. We were never the kings, the viscounts, the emperors. We had no state power. There were no others around. Not that many. It was the Roman people and us, basically. But the people who created Israel realized that we are about to become Europe's ultimate victim. We were not sent there by some empires. We had to run away for our lives. We had to run for our lives. This is why we went there. We went back to our ancient homeland because we were about to die. And we did die. We lost 1/3 of our people. We experienced one of the worst human catastrophes of the 20th century. Does that justify settlement building? No. Does it justify occupation? No. But when people believe that the Jews are not allowed to discuss their history, this is the context. We are still don't have the numbers we had in 1939. 71 years have passed since the end of World War II. The Jewish people is still much smaller than it was before the war. We are maimed. We are today still bleeding because of that. And when I wrote my book, what struck me most was that young Israel of the 1950s and 60s that was created against all odds. And who are the people populating it? The masters of the universe? British gentry? German Junkers? It was Holocaust survivors. People with numbers tattooed into their arms. People with nightmares at night. People who just lost their family a few years before and now created a new family, sometimes not telling their new boys and girls about the other boys and girls they had 7 years before. But these people decided that they will not become victims of victimhood. They decided their revenge will not be suicide bombing. Their revenge will be to live, to build a health system that is better than yours, and an education system better than what we have today, and build a nation out of ashes. And the other half of Israelis were refugees from the Arab world. Not Vikings, not Dutch imperialists, Arabs, Jewish Arabs, who were thrown out of the Arab world and had no other place to come. So basically what created Israel is Holocaust survivors and refugees from the Arab world. This is the makeup of this country. But let me tell you that sadly this is not only the past. Some people try to deny the fact that there is anti-Semitism and that anti-Semitism is as ugly as racism or homophobia or chauvinism. For some years, anti-Semitism was on a retreat. Because of the trauma of the Holocaust, many people felt guilty about it. But throughout Europe today, so many Jews have a difficulty expressing themselves religiously. It's difficult to wear a kippah today in much of Europe. So many old Jewish communities are collapsing because Jews don't feel safe. So we are so lucky to have Israel on the one side and to have America that is so different than Europe and many other countries in the world. But here and there, even here, the ancient disease is back. I'm not into being phobic about it. Again, I don't accept it when some Jewish leaders use this in order to justify things we should not justify. But let us remember that in the end of the day, the Jews are a minority that has been treated badly and in many parts of the world, not in America, are still treated badly. So again, does this mean you should not criticize Israel? You should criticize Israel when you think Israel is doing wrong things, just like you criticize any other nation. We are no better and no worse. And we do wrong things, criticize it. Does this mean that any critical discussion about it is anti-Semitic? Not at all. But context. My one request is let's have context, reasonable context. I want to end soon, but let me say something about the future. In my mind, there is no other way but the two-state way. I know that the one-state solution for Israel-Palestine is becoming trendy in many American campuses, perhaps even here. So let me say just one thing about the one-state solution. We've tried it. We've tried it in a country called Syria. We put Sunnis, Alawites, Druze, and Christians in one country in the Middle East. As long as the dictator was strong, it was no Denmark, it somehow worked in a Middle Eastern kind of way. The moment the dictator got weak, we are experiencing the worst human catastrophe on the face of the planet, with the world totally incompetent in dealing with this. As I said, we don't even know if it's 250,000 or 500,000 people that died. We know that more than 10 million lost their homes. The country is totally devastated. Sometimes it looks like an atomic bomb exploded over it. Is this what we want for Israel-Palestine? Do we think that what failed across our border will work with Israelis and Palestinians with all their traumatic past? The one-state solution is like a beautiful poisoned apple. It looks nice, it seems nice, it's lethal. So with all the difficulties, the two-state way is the only way. We are homeless people, we must have a home. The Palestinians are homeless people, they must have a home. We must find a way to try to end occupation in a new way, in a reasonable way, in a realistic way, with determination and imagination. We must stop settlement activity. We must rebuild Gaza. We must have a Marshall Plan that will give life to the Palestinians living in Gaza. We must have water project, energy project, housing projects. We must see that every Palestinian has more freedom, more political space, and more hope. Even if we cannot end the conflict tomorrow, we must create a process that would lead us to a better place, so eventually we'll have the peace we'll all yearn for. There is no alternative. If we'll just be preoccupied with the past, who did what to whom, who was the first, who was the worst, we'll just destroy the future. We must concentrate. It's a moral obligation on having peace rather than have this ongoing hostility and venom and a vicious approach that just makes things worse, doesn't bring remedy to anyone. I will not hide from you the fact that in order to have that, we in Israel must win the battle for Israel's soul. And there is an ongoing battle for Israel's soul. There are dark forces in Israel too, which we have to fight. But I believe that the majority of Israelis can be brought to the right kind of track. They are now traumatized, as I said. They are held hostage by the extreme right. We must help them have trust again and take a leap of faith like we did in the past. But if we are to do that, we need your help. We need cooperation. Rather than have a kind of alliance between Tea Party America and Tea Party Israel, we need an alliance between enlightened America and enlightened Israel. We need you to help us create a future for both us and the Palestinians. So my one request, as I end my words now, is let us not be seduced by hate. Let us not go for demonization. It doesn't solve any problem. It doesn't help one Palestinian. It doesn't bring us closer to peace. Let us try a different route that is based on mutual respect, on commitment to human integrity, to human rights, and to the human spirit. And with that sort of approach, let's try to build a future, a just and peaceful future for both Israelis and Palestinians who have been the victims of such an ongoing, horrific tragedy. Thank you very much. And now please do what Tzach asked you to do and ask all the difficult questions. Yes, please. And please say who you are, so I...
My name is Joey, New York City. Stand up. Okay, sure, yeah. I'm Joey from New York City. My question is, I guess, what can it take for a two-state solution to actually occur? What are the actual steps that, I guess, government officials from both Israel and Palestine could make, or is it not government anymore? Do you have any some concrete steps that could make progress occur?
Question. So the question, what's the practical route forward? So first of all, let me tell you, don't tell anyone, it's a secret, that I'm really giving this issue a lot of thought these days. I've decided not just to write like a journalist who complains about why the world is wrong, but try to think of ideas how to fix it. So I'm deeply in a kind of study of really looking what failed in the past and what should we do differently. So basically, I think we have to understand that although there is no alternative to the two-state way, the way we tried to do it, which is like to have a document that will end the conflict overnight, probably it won't work. So I'm willing, I'd love to be proven wrong. You know, I always say, had I been in power, and I will never be in power, but had I been in power, the first thing that I'll do is to give the Palestinians the most generous Israeli offer, like in the past, and even more than that. And try it. Perhaps I'm wrong, and perhaps we can sign an agreement and end the whole thing within a month or a year. But assuming that doesn't work, and I think it's Israel's obligation, moral and political obligation, to try that, to reach out and try. But say it doesn't work, and what happened in 2000 and 2008, 2014 happens again, which is failure. I think that what we should do is a number of things. First of all, stop settlement activity at once. This is something we control, and I think that the moment we freeze settlements, I think, first of all, we stop this bleeding to death of the two-state option, and we say to the Palestinians, we mean business. We don't want to take your land. We are keeping it for you until we sort things out. But we are not, while in the process, we are not taking the land. And so a settlement freeze is something that I would do immediately. Number two, as I said, a Marshall Plan for Gaza. You've heard what I think about Hamas. But there are 1.7 million Palestinians living in the Gaza Strip. They are human beings. They are my neighbors. They are my other. I'm morally committed to them, And if they don't have a decent life, I will not have a life either. So both for moral reasons and political reasons, real political reasons, I must give the people of Gaza life and hope. What can I do? The people of Gaza don't have decent drinking water. And they'll have a major water crisis within 5 to 7 years. Israel has the best water technology in the world. If we can help save California, we can definitely help save Gaza. So if we will take Saudi money and sponsor, finance Israeli technology to build the best desal plants in the world on the Gaza shore, so the people of Gaza will have water, one will prevent a human catastrophe and will prove that we are doing things to help people. You know, we live in a desert, not quite like here. Water is important for everyone, and it has almost biblical significance. If we'll be bringing water to Gaza rather than just artillery shells, everything will look different. Then we need to bring energy. They don't have enough electricity in Gaza. We just discovered a lot of natural gas. If we'll give either for free or almost free, if I'm willing to give it for free, and perhaps for others at cost level, which is quite cheap, if we'll have a gas pipe directly from our natural resources in the Mediterranean to Gaza, so they have as much energy as they need. So I want them to have electricity 36 hours a day. That begins a difference. It begins a process. Then they need housing. We really have to make Gaza Singapore. It won't happen over day. But if we bring a kind of, in the Gulf countries, we have so many amazing, oases of prosperity. If we do Abu Dhabi in Gaza, again, everything will look different. Now, this is not a substitute to a political process, because I'm committed to have Palestine. We need a Palestinian state. But if I begin the process by having a Marshall Plan for Gaza and stopping settlements, I think I begin to change the mindset. I want my fellow Israelis to know that I'm committed to our neighbors, that we do it not because we are forced, because we are committed ourselves. I want the Palestinians to know that we are not only about military operations and incursions and all that. Then I think we can build a process where Israel gradually, it cannot happen overnight, gradually pulls out of parts of the West Bank in a cautious, creative way. So there is a larger Palestinian political space until eventually there is a fully sovereign state. One of the options to do it is the fact that today so many of our Arab neighbors are actually looking to Israel as a partner. So if we put the Egyptians, the Jordanians, the Saudis, the Gulf countries as our partners, we create a kind of regional structure that helps Israelis and Palestinians overcome their differences and really work on future building, on nation building. I think we can create that process knowing that the conflict won't end overnight and it'll take time, but we must be determined and we must prove that we are changing reality on the ground every day, that we are not just waiting for some Messiah to come. Did I answer your question? Yes, please. Jason?
So if you've read, since you have some of the news coming out of Vassar regarding Israel, a lot of it centers around a vote that we had, and it seems they're going to have again on, boycott, divestment, sanction for PTS. I was wondering where you stood on that line.
Well, this is something that I want to hear more. The question was about BDS and Vassar and the vote you had and the vote you will have. Look, I think I answered your question indirectly while speaking, but I'll repeat it again. I think that the attitude, look, the key, for better and for worse, Israel is a democracy. We take our decisions in the polls. We vote, we elect our. The way to bring about change, to end occupation, to get on the two-state way, is to convince the majority of Israelis that there is a world out there, in America out there, Europe, an international community, that on the one hand demands of us to do the right thing regarding occupation and settlement, but on the other hand stands by us and will support us when we do the right thing, which is a risky thing. I feel we must do it. But there are, when I talked about the past, there are a lot of danger. There's danger there. There are risks to be taken. If Israelis will feel that they are boycotted, that there are sanctions against them, that the world is after us, Israelis will just close ranks and you will bring about an internal rule of the Israeli extreme right. So it's, again, leave aside the moral issues. If you have to decide, what do you want? You want to bring about peace? You come with love? Or you're about hate? I don't know. There is a connection between the goal and the means. If you're using hate, if your rhetoric is hateful, and you emphasize hate, and you don't reach out to humans, and you don't try to have dialogue, and you censor people, and you don't listen to them, I think this, leave aside Israel, there's something wrong about it. There is an internal contradiction. But beyond it, politically, it is disruptive. This will bring about, I don't want to sound overdramatic, this will bring about catastrophe. Because if Israelis will freeze and will not allow themselves to be generous and to take the risks, sooner or later, first of all, the ongoing situation is unbearable, but it will get worse. We've seen a bit of it in the last months, but it can get worse. With ISIS around, with Jewish extremists around, Muslim extremists around, Palestinian extremists, settler extremists, if we will not create a positive process that has some positive energy to it, we can face dramatic, tragic events. So I want to hope that the people who are promoting these motions just make a mistake. I hope that they don't have but so I'm asking, because I'm not into confrontation but into dialogue, I'm saying if you really care about Palestinians, and if you care about Israelis, if you are not anti-Semitic, if you are not about hate, both the good of Israelis and Palestinians calls for a totally different approach. So demand of Israel to do the right thing, but offer Israelis actually a hug if they do. If you just denounce them and demonize them, the outcome will be catastrophic. Yes, please. Thank you. Look, on the face of it, part of the problem, I could have spent hours now explaining all the details of the problems. I don't want to bore you with too much details, but generally, one of the problems, one of the reasons we failed in the past, that on both sides, you don't have much of a leadership, and there is inherent political weakness, even of the good guys, so to speak, on both sides. And it's very different. Because again, Israel has a problem. I'm very critical of our leadership, but beyond it, say we have the right prime minister walks into the office tomorrow. The Israeli political system is in disarray, and it'll take. This is one of the reasons we need a gradual process. We probably cannot do the whole thing, even if there was a prime minister who wants to do the whole thing overnight. Okay, but on the Palestinian side, I mean, our political mess is nothing compared to what you have on the Palestinian side. Because first we have the division of Hamas and the PA, the Abbas. So it's actually two entities that hate each other. They hate each other more than they hate us. They actually kill each other. Then you have the young Palestinians who are disillusioned with both. So and Abbas, sadly, the Palestinian Authority is getting weaker and weaker, partly because of Israeli mistakes, but not only because of Israeli mistakes. So we need to help the Palestinians create the leadership and create the structure. This is why we need a deep, creative, thought-through process to help the positive forces in Palestinian society. I have my Palestinian hero. My Palestinian hero is Salam Fayyad. He was the prime minister of the Palestinian Authority until a few years ago. He's the one Palestinian that I'm sure wants to build a future for the young people. One of the tragedies of the Palestinian people is that while they were in conflict with us and still are, they didn't have the kind of leadership that we had that actually built a nation during conflict. We, while being in a tragedy, really did what I said before. We created a nation in an astonishing way, in an almost miraculous way. The different leaders, the Mufti, the Shukeri, the Yasser Arafat, never really cared about building, about the schools and hospitals. And this is why Fayyad is such a hero, because he's the first one who came there and really said, while I have my issues with the Israelis, I want to build Palestine first. And he did amazing work for 7 years in the West Bank. And in many ways, the West Bank is much better than it used to be because of him. So he's out of power. Salam Fayyad is really, I think he should have been given a Nobel Peace Prize, really. And in time, then perhaps he would have still been in office. I hope he'll be back. But whether it's him or not, Fayyadism is what we have to work. That spirit, and there is that spirit. So although you have extremism, so many Palestinians, they want a life. And definitely the younger generation is in many ways potentially globalized. And it'll go either or. If we give them some hope, and they want to join the world, even they have issues with Israel. If they don't have hope, they're attracted by ISIS. It'll be much worse than Hamas. ISIS is the next thing. So I think that we have to work with the Palestinian business community, with the moderate leaders, with the Fayyad-like figures. There is a Palestinian middle class that we have to enlarge. I think that work can be done, but we need a creative, again, it's not, the old approach was either or. Either we have a perfect comprehensive peace tomorrow morning or nothing. And we ended up with nothing, just more and more settlement building. I think that if we work with the Fayyad-like forces, we can move forward, and that has to do with your other question. Look, I'm willing to make compromises in Jerusalem. I'm willing to make any concession that is not suicidal, that will really create a stable situation between the two states. But obviously, Jerusalem is so difficult, even with my willingness to, and we have to be so much mature on both sides. And I don't know if the Swiss and the Swedes can right now run Jerusalem together. Definitely not the Israelis and Palestinians with all the. So we must postpone the Jerusalem issue to the end, while making sure that we do not make things worse, and actually making things much better within the context. I mean, much more justice to Palestinians, much more prosperity in the Palestinian neighborhoods, as much freedom as possible, moving in the right direction, but there is no way to solve the Jerusalem issue where we stand right now. We all have to grow up before we can do that. There was some, yes please, Matt. Just a bit louder and tell people who you are. I know who you are. But.
I was wondering what your idea of a Jewish state is and what it means to be Jewish at state without necessarily alienating or privileging certain people over others to remain a Jew.
Well, that's a deep one, and again, I'll give you just a short, shallow question, so people answer, so people don't. Look, there are two issues. One of the complexity of the Jewish state issue and is that the Jewish life have two dimensions: the religion and the peoplehood. And and I understand why people get confused, because they think that when you say Jewish state, you mean imposing like the religion on, which is of course ridiculous and not the case and should not be the case. And this is like the argument I have with some of the ultra religious or ultra-nationalists within Israel who do try to do that, but they are really the minority. The issue is a very simple one. To have one state, one nation, where the Jews can express themselves as a people while respecting the rights of all non-Jews. So this is the whole point. The whole point is that on the one hand, you have a place, as I said, a home for this homeless people, but within the home, every non-Jew is totally equal in every way. He can vote, he can be elected, he can elect, he can be elected. Now, Israel has done actually, look, I don't want to state figures that are usually used by Israeli PR, but it is true that probably the only Arabs who can really who can vote in totally free elections and really be representatives in the parliament, I wouldn't say they're only, but let's put it this way. Israel is one of the very few countries in the Middle East where this happens. More than that, the Muslim minority in Israel is much better represented than most Muslim minorities in Europe. Just if you look at the share of representation. And yet, we have such a long way to go, because in real life, Israeli Palestinians, non-Jews, are still discriminated against in so many ways. Budgets, planning, many issues. So Israel must, in my mind, if it is to keep the legitimacy of the Jewish democratic state, it must prove that the democratic dimension of its life is so meaningful, so substantial, that it overcomes all these fears that you are trying to create a kind of theocracy that actually doesn't respect the others. But I have to tell you one thing about this sensitivity. Many people complain about the Israeli national anthem or the flag, and they say, how can non-Jews relate to that anthem? In this sense, America is so different than most democracies in the world. Because most democracies in the world are nation states that are based on one ethnic group, and they are judged how do they treat their minorities. My British cousins, the head of their state is the head of church. Queen Elizabeth is the Queen of the United Kingdom. She's the head of the Anglican Church. No one says that the United Kingdom is not legitimate because of that. When my British cousins look at their flag, they see so many crosses there, you don't know how to count them. But they live with this. They realize there is a Christian element to British life, but as long as Britain respects them as individuals, as a minority, they live with this. And I could have given you 20 more examples, but Britain is like a striking example because it's like the mother of democracies. So it's a very fine, the kind of attack of really singling out Israel or singling out the Jewish people, that they have no right to express themselves collectively, politically, is something you only hear. You don't hear any complaints about the way Japan is much more homogeneous than Israel. Israel is so much more diverse. Just walk the streets of Tel Aviv or Jerusalem. You see people of every color, of every religion. And Israel is today such a colorful, it's such a feast of diversity. So, and there are so many countries that are much more homogeneous and ethnically based. So the attack on Israel in this sense partly comes from this misunderstanding of the complexity of the Jewish identity, but a lot of it comes from a kind of unwillingness to give the Jews what others have. I say we are no better than others. No, we're not worse than others. We have to be treated like other people are treated. We don't have any privileges. But when there is the kind of vicious, and this is why put aside the occupation and settlement, that's where we are doing things that other democracies don't do and we should not be doing. But when people are trying to delegitimize Israel at its core, look, there are many issues. I go around so many campuses. I don't know how it is in Vassar. I did not yet find a very strong boycott China movement, free Tibet. Now, China does not have an existential threat. The Chinese are not 14 million people endangered with an unclear future. And they occupy Tibet. And they have their equivalent of settlement policy, which is much more aggressive. How is it that of all that, only people are obsessed with what Israel is doing? There's something weird about that phenomenon. So us people, to be fair, again, where Israel is doing wrong, criticize it. But this kind of singling out attitude, I think, is unacceptable. I'll take 3 questions and combine them and let you, the young lady there, please. Just raise your voice a bit. So, one was about selective BS, and the other? Okay, I'll answer that. Yes, please.
Hi, my name is Ethan Cohen. Earlier in your lecture, you said that before 1967, there was no occupation and there was not a single settlement. As a history major, I don't know exactly how to take that seriously because I know that in 1948, the Israeli army expelled 750,000 Palestinians explicitly to make room for Jewish settlers, who were themselves victims of violence, of course, but also profited from the dispossession of Palestinians. Furthermore, the Galilee region was mostly ruled militarily until 1966. So I don't see how I can take that claim seriously. And so my question is, a city like Jaffa, whose Palestinian population was expelled more or less in 1948 and built with Jewish settlers, how is that not a settlement?
Okay. Yes, yes, please. First you, and then you. We'll take 4, and then.
Hi, my name's Henry. I just wrote down my question. Your narration of the formation of Israel attributes the establishment of the state to the influx of Jewish refugees from Nazi Europe in the late 1940s and from Arab nations in the early 1950s. I noticed a critical gap in your contextual frame here as you seem to be ignoring the importance of the preceding half-century of interplay between Zionist political leaders and European imperial powers, in particular Britain. Could you speak to how you think the ideological and political architects of the state of Israel, who did in fact draw on European colonial sources in their literature, shaped in the past and continues to shape today the context of the conflict?
Thank you. And you, please. That's the last one to take.
Just for identity purposes, I'm Michael McCarthy. I'm a retired professor of philosophy at Vassar. First of all, thank you for your book. This is something I've thought and studied about a long time, and I've learned more from your book than any other single text I've ever read.
Thank you so much.
Number 2, towards the end of the book, you talk about 7 threats facing contemporary Israel. I thought that was well done. What I wish you had done for the audience today, and this is what my question is, a lot of the threats are external, as you mentioned, Islam, Arab nationalism, etc. But towards the end, you focus in on the divisions internal to contemporary Israeli society, particularly insofar as those divisions are political and really polarizing and divisive, and partly account for what you regularly criticize throughout the book as the inadequacy of leadership in the last 15 or 20 years. So my question is, especially in the light of your concern about the two-state solution, could you amplify for us what those divisions are as you see them, the 7th threat, as you call it?
Okay.
Particularly, and be as concrete and realistic about this as possible. That's one of the nice features of your thinking. It's not airy-fairy. Particularly how you could get some kind of unity within the contemporary Israeli politics that could begin to undertake some of the remedial policies that you were recommending that do seem to me unduly optimistic given the fractured state of contemporary Israeli politics.
So thank you all for your questions. Great question. I'm sure the other questions are great as well, but we'll stick with these. So I'll begin with you. So I tried to answer it before you asked it. I think that let me say what I think the right approach is. The right approach is really to make this distinction, which I'll soon have to answer the questions about it. Those people on the extreme left and extreme right who put it all as one thing, and the other accept all Israeli policies, or they reject Israel in totality, I think it's not only politically and historically wrong, I think it's immoral. I think it's immoral, sir. Because as I said, there is a tragedy here. The only way is the two-state way, and therefore, if the message will be demand of Israel to do its share in order to try to end occupation and stop settlements, I think that's the right approach. And what I will encourage liberal Jews in this country, and by the way, non-Jews who care about Israel as well, any person who cares about it for whatever reason, that it's important to really work on strengthening the moderate forces both in Israel and Palestine. Because right now, and it has to do with your question, everything is spiraling out of control in the wrong way. And we all need, the reasonable people, the enlightened people, as I said, who are struggling in a candid way with the tension between our values and this brutal reality. Let's work together. So I would encourage any young, liberal Jew or non-Jew who cares about Israel-Palestine to be engaged in this kind of statement. You must do the utmost to end occupation, but we'll be there with you when you do it. And we'll work with you and we'll support you. I have the privilege of visiting Washington, D.C. every now and then, and when American leaders ask me what should be done, I say this. Make this conditional, bring this conditional love. Okay? On the one hand, demand of Israel to do the right thing, but really prove to everybody that you will be with it. First of all, that you see the danger, that you realize there is this horrific reality all around us. It's not only some sort of fears, it's in our minds, it's really dangerous. Let's walk together hand in hand, the decent people, in a courageous, creative way in the right direction. Regarding the problems within Israel, so again, it's a bit late to describe the whole complexity, but basically speaking, brief history, Israeli history. The beginning, young Israel in the 50s and 60s was an amazing, in my mind, it's really a triumph of the human spirit in creating a nation against all odds in the most difficult circumstances. And there was an amazing ethos that held the country together that was at the time basically secular socialist ethos. I think it did wonders. My heart is with that. But there was a terrible price because so many non-secular, non-Ashkenazi, non-socialist Jews and non-Jews were oppressed. And I see his entire history of the last 30, 40 years is a kind of rebellions of the different minorities that were oppressed that for good reason rebelled against this old Laborite regime, the ancien regime of Israel. And this should have happened because there was a kind of injustice built into the revolution. And I sometimes say, there was injustice done, but your greatest president forged this nation at a terrible human price. I mean, you had your civil war under Abe Lincoln, and probably without that you were not able to forge this as one union. So we went through this in our history. There were sins, there were suffering. It was part of this huge enormous historical process, but we never found a way to deal with this. So many people in Israel feel bitter, angry, one minority against the other, what we call the division into tribes now. The challenge for Israel in the future, really in my mind, is to rebuild a republic that is really democratic, that respects, that has cohesion, that is effective as one republic, so we can deal with occupation and other major issues, but this is the most major. But at the same time, respecting the Israeli Arabs, the Israeli Palestinians, the ultra-Orthodox, the national religious, the Mizrahim, the Sephardic Jews, the Ashkenazi Jews, the immigration from Russia. We have to give, and in this sense, I actually see an inspiration in your idea of hyphenated identity in this country. The fact that you can have your own specific community while being an American. It actually enhances your identity as American, doesn't reduce. We need to learn from you in this sense and create some sort of new way to have a really effective, a deep democracy while finding a way to have a functional political system, which we don't at the moment. So while we have to deal with occupation and settlements, we have to redefine our political system and our identity as a nation, in a sense, in order to deal with this huge issue. And now I'll deal with I really appreciate your questions, although, as you can imagine, they did not make me especially happy. So let me try to answer it in a really respectful and deep way and sincere as much as I can. So first of all, let's begin with the issue of 1948, the Nakba, which I write about in my book. Obviously, and I write about it intensively, so many Palestinians experienced such a terrible tragedy, and so many of them lost their homes and their civilization. But again, look at the context. Don't ever, ever forget the context. And there are at least, again, in this specific issue, at least 3 layers of context. One is the fact that it was, just as I said, a terrible civil war. There were no villains and no innocent victims. Wherever the Palestinians won, wherever the Arab forces had the upper hand, not one Jew remained at home. Not one Jew. So there's empirical facts, it's not a theory, that had it gone the other way, it wouldn't have been only some of the Jews that would have been deported. All the Jews would have been deported. And there's very strong reason to think that the Jews not only would have been deported, they would have been slaughtered. So the reason we can now talk and write about the Nakba, and we should, is because it so happened that the Jewish community won. The reason I was able to write about Lida, what happened in Lida, was because we won. But had we lost, my hometown of Rehovot would have been dead, and all its residents would have been dead. It wouldn't have been just Jewish refugees. We would have had 650,000 people probably slaughtered. So that's one layer of context. The second layer of context, that it was the 1940s. It wasn't 2016. And I ask you as students of history to remember that. And I'm not talking about the Nazis now. The 1940s, during the war and after the war, were brutal. With all the difficulties of the world we live today, it's so much more refined, except for in the Middle East and in Syria, than then. Tens of millions of people lost their homes, were driven out of their homes. In India, in Pakistan, in Poland, in Czechoslovakia. If I'll hear you demanding the right of return of all the German refugees to their original homes in the Sudeten, in eastern Poland, in Pakistan, in India, then I'm willing to discuss Israel. But only neo-Nazis talk about the right of return in Europe. Only neo-Nazis. It's not an acceptable conversation in Europe. Because every European knows that if we'll open these Pandora boxes, Europe will be gone. We'll have a new horrible war throughout Europe. So for the sake of the future, all reasonable Europeans understand what happened, happened. And we put a line and we build a future. Only with Israel there is that obsession. Layer number 3. I wrote about the tragedy of Lida, what happened to the Palestinians there. Dresden was 100 times worse than Lida. Nagasaki and Hiroshima were 1,000 times worse than Lida. No one No one says the United Kingdom is not legitimate because of Dresden, and no one says the United States is not legitimate because of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. We can discuss Dresden, we can discuss Hiroshima and Nagasaki, we should discuss Lida. But context, of all the people in the world, the one people of whom you demand some standards that you do not demand of any other people, is this small, endangered people? Context number 4, last one. In so many campuses, people doubt Israel's legitimacy. Your talk about the connection with the colonial powers, which I don't. First of all, regarding your questions, we had some connections with empires. I assume you respect the Palestinian liberation movement. Am I wrong? I'm not wrong. You respect it. The leader, the hero of the Palestinian liberation movement, was negotiating with Adolf Hitler. Does that make the Palestinian liberation movement not legitimate? Do you hold it against the Palestinians? Why is it? Why is this obsession not to accept Jewish policy, Jewish diplomacy, Israeli state actions, the way that other countries? So again, and I'll end with this layer number 4, I go, travel, I listen to students in so many campuses. I didn't see one anti-Australian movement in North America. I love Australia. I think it's a wonderful country. It's a kind of British California. But if Australia is legitimate, Israel is definitely legitimate. We didn't go in British fleet ships to the other side of the globe to take some country we had no connection with. We went back to our ancient homeland, to which we prayed and yearned throughout the years, in which we created some of the most important assets for human civilization. And we went there because we had an existential need. If there was no Israel, long term there will be no Jewish people. We will have just Orthodox Jews. Non-Orthodox, secular Jewish civilization depends on having one place where we can have our identity. And we were facing the worst human catastrophe possible. So our need to go there was existential need. The people who went to Australia didn't have any existential need. So in a second way, we are much more legitimate than Australia. And then, talking about what you talk about, 95% of the indigenous population in Australia disappeared. They're not refugees, they disappeared. I'm so aware of the Palestinian tragedy, but the Palestinians are alive and kicking. There are so many of them. They should have a home, they should have the rights, but they are there. If I'm not mistaken, the name of this city was not bought by British immigrants and settlers, neither by Dutch. Some other people lived here. Other people lived here. They are gone. You are able to have these wonderful discussions you are having in Vassar, in this magnificent campus, in this beautiful city. We are privileged. You are privileged. You have the privilege, which I admire, of having a democracy, having freedom, having the ability to have these wonderful discussions you are having. This is all based on the fact that your other people are gone. So what I ask for is decency. I'm not into whitewashing. As I said 3 times, when Israel is wrong, criticize it. But as Shakespeare said, we too have a right to live. We have a right to live. And I ask all decent people to acknowledge the fact that the Jewish people have a right to live in their ancient homeland. Thank you very much.